You know that moment when you have nothing to do, your phone is in your hand, you've already checked everything, there is nowhere you need to be, so you stare at the wall for a few seconds. Eventually, you reach for the phone again. For you, boredom can disappear in less than 10 seconds. But imagine having no phone, no television, no books, no internet, no music streaming through your headphones. Now imagine that world 40,000 years ago. You have finished eating, the fire is burning, the day's hunting is over, and there is nothing you need to do for the next several hours. So what do? For most of human history, boredom wasn't something you could escape with a screen. And yet, prehistoric humans left behind evidence of something strange. They were doing things that had almost nothing to do with immediate survival. At Blombos Cave in South Africa, people deliberately engraved ochre around 75,000 to 100,000 years ago. At Chauvet Cave in France, humans created hundreds of animal images beginning around 36,500 years ago. These people weren't simply making tools. They were making marks, decorating objects, creating images, and possibly doing something much more familiar to you than survival. They were finding ways to fill empty time. But here's the strange part. We can't actually prove that prehistoric humans experienced boredom exactly as you do. There is no fossilized feeling, no ancient diary saying, "I'm bored." So to understand what people did when nothing demanded their attention, you have to look at what they chose to do when they didn't have to. And that evidence changes the picture of prehistoric life, because your ancestors may have had something you rarely experience anymore: time with nothing to interrupt it. A piece of ochre from Blombos contains a cross-hatched pattern. It was made roughly 73,000 years ago. The lines don't appear to be accidental. Someone deliberately drew them. We don't know what the pattern meant. Maybe it had symbolic meaning, maybe it communicated information, maybe it was decoration, maybe someone simply enjoyed making the pattern. Whatever the reason, the action itself required something precious: time. For decades, people imagined hunter-gatherers as living in a constant emergency. Wake up, find food, avoid predators, build shelter, repeat. But anthropology has complicated that picture. Hunter-gatherer societies can spend substantial amounts of time gathering food. They prepare it, they rest, they talk, they care for children, they make tools, they maintain social relationships. They could have had long stretches of time with no urgent task. The sun had gone down, the food was prepared, the tools were repaired, the fire was still burning. And then what? You couldn't open an app. So perhaps you talked, perhaps you watched the fire, perhaps you played, perhaps you told stories, perhaps you made something that didn't need to exist. There is another clue, and it comes from something even harder to preserve than art: play. A game leaves no fossil, a joke leaves no artifact. A story disappears when the person telling it dies, but some activities leave traces. At Diepkloof Rock Shelter in South Africa, people were engraving patterns onto ostrich eggshell containers around 60,000 years ago. More than 270 fragments with geometric markings have been identified. These markings appear repeatedly. That suggests they weren't random scratches. Someone cared about making them. Someone also cared about repeating them. But we still don't know exactly why. Humans don't only make things because they are useful. You decorate useful objects. You alter them. You give them patterns. And that behavior appears deep in our history. Then there is another activity that leaves almost no physical evidence: storytelling. You can't excavate a prehistoric story. You can't carbon date a conversation. At Wonderwork Cave in South Africa, humans were using fire roughly 1 million years ago. Fire changed the night. It provided warmth, it provided light, and it created a natural place for people to gather. So the people around the fire became the entertainment and the source of information. An experienced hunter could describe an animal's behavior. A parent could teach a child which plants were dangerous. Someone could describe a distant valley. Someone else could remember a previous journey. Humans also tell stories because humans tell stories. That distinction matters, because once the basic needs were handled, your ancestors didn't suddenly become inactive. They had conversations, they made objects, they created images, they probably played, they rested, and they watched one another. Consider childhood. A modern child can spend hours playing without producing anything useful. A stick becomes a sword, a box becomes a spaceship, a pile of stones becomes a game. From an adult perspective, none of this accomplishes much. But developmental scientists have long argued that play can help children practice skills they will later need. And humans aren't the only animals that play. Young chimpanzees play, young wolves play, young dolphins play. So play is not simply a modern response to having free time. It is deeply rooted in animal behavior. For prehistoric human children, play may have been especially important. A child could imitate hunting, practice throwing, learn social rules, copy adults, test boundaries. The activity looked like wasting time, but underneath it, the brain was learning. So perhaps prehistoric boredom wasn't always empty. Sometimes it created space for learning. But there is still a deeper question. What did adults do when there was truly nothing urgent left? No hunting, no gathering, no tool that needed repair, no child that needed attention, just time. Because the things you probably did during those moments may have been the things least likely to survive. You talked, you laughed, you sat beside someone, you did nothing. And that may be the strangest part part of prehistoric boredom. Your ancestors may not have been trying to eliminate boredom at all. They may have simply accepted it. That sounds strange now. You live in a world designed to remove empty moments. A waiting room has a screen, a bus has Wi-Fi, a 5-minute break gives you notifications. But for most of human history, there was nothing to fill it with. If you finished your work early, you waited. If the sun went down, you waited for morning. And sometimes, you simply sat there. None of these activities had to produce anything. And that matters because humans don't seem to require constant productivity. We evolved with periods of rest, periods of play, periods of social interaction, and periods of doing almost nothing. A stone tool survives for tens of thousands of years. A conversation doesn't survive for 10 minutes. A quiet evening beside a fire disappears completely. So when you look at prehistoric archaeology, you are looking at a distorted version of human life. You see the things that survived. You don't see the hours that didn't. Maybe your ancestor sat beside a fire for an hour. Maybe they watched someone shape a stone. Maybe they listened to a story they had already heard 10 times. Maybe they stared into the darkness. Maybe they were bored. And maybe that boredom wasn't a problem that needed solving. It was simply part of being human. Because boredom existed long before smartphones, long before television, long before electricity. The difference is that your ancestors couldn't immediately escape it. And that may have changed what they did with it. A meaningless hour could become a conversation. A conversation could become a story. A story could become knowledge. And sometimes, nothing happened at all. That is the part archaeology can barely show you. The quiet, the waiting, the empty hours between survival. Yet those hours were still part of your history. Your ancestors weren't surviving every second. They were living. And perhaps the most ancient human experience isn't hunting, fire, or migration. It's sitting beside someone you know, with nowhere else to be, and nothing that needs to happen next. If you enjoyed this journey into our past, subscribe for more stories about where we came from, and I'll see you in the next one.